The Harbor Kings. Loyalty in the Shadows. By Francis Jones. Harbor Kings, Baltimore, 1967. The city's shadows are as deep as its secrets, and for Frankie James, they've always been a second home. A decorated Force Recon Marine returning from Vietnam, Frankie comes back to find his father, Big Frank, ensnared in a deadly debt to the infamous Vito the Wolf Moretti. Determined to protect his family, Frankie steps into Baltimore's seedy underworld, where loyalty is fleeting and power is everything. But Frankie isn't just a soldier, he's a tactician, a fighter, and a leader. What begins as a desperate attempt to settle his father's debts evolves into something far greater, a bold and dangerous vision. Frankie gathers a tight-knit crew of trusted friends, including his sharp-witted war buddy Ron Kitterman, the feral fighter Randy, and a network of rough-edged allies. Together, they challenge the old ways of the Baltimore underworld, blending military precision with street smarts to carve their own path. As Frankie's crew begins to rise, they face opposition on all sides, from Moretti's relentless enforcer Bobby Vella to the ambitious and unpredictable Paulie Moretti to the Wolf himself. Along the way, Frankie and his men must navigate betrayal, violence, and their own moral lines, questioning how far they're willing to go to rule Baltimore's underground, or die trying. Harbor Kings is a gritty, noir-inspired military thriller about power, loyalty, and survival. With its rich characters, dark atmosphere, and relentless pace, it weaves a tale of ambition and brotherhood set against the shadowy backdrop of a city where the strong take all and the weak are forgotten. Frankie James and his crew aren't just fighting for their lives. They're fighting to claim the crown of Baltimore's underworld. Chapter 1. Welcome to South Baltimore. The hiss of steam and the shrill whistle of a locomotive punctuated the evening air as the train groaned to a stop at the South Baltimore depot. The smell of hot iron and engine grease hit Frankie James like a slap, mingling with the faint tang of salt water carried inland from the harbor. As he stepped down from the train, his boots made a hollow thud on the concrete platform, a sound swallowed by the rhythmic clang of workers unloading freight. The air was thick, heavy with the grime of industry and the weight of time. The city stretched before him, a tableau of rusted metal and brick buildings, its narrow alleys still whispering secrets he'd once known. 6 years hadn't softened its edges. Baltimore still wore its grit like armor. Frankie inhaled deeply, tasting the city, a mix of diesel, sweat, and decay, and exhaled with a weariness that wasn't just about the journey. His olive green service jacket hung open, the sharp creases of his Marine Corps uniform still visible beneath the trench coat he wore to blunt the evening chill. Frankie adjusted the duffel slung over his shoulder, its weight a minor inconvenience compared to the unseen load he carried. The platform was alive with movement. Dock workers shouted orders, grease-stained men hauled crates from boxcars, and cigarette smoke swirled in lazy spirals under jaundiced lights. Every detail hit him like a memory sharpened to a razor's edge.
"Hey, Frankie."
The voice was rough, like gravel scraped against steel. Frankie's body tensed, his hand twitching toward his side before his mind caught up. 6 years of war did that to a man. He turned, and there he was, Charlie Russo. Leaning against a black Mercury coupe, Charlie's smirk was as familiar as the peeling posters on the depot walls. His sharp suit couldn't hide its frayed cuffs, and the toothpick wagging between his teeth had the cocky rhythm of someone who knew the score and wasn't afraid to remind you. Charlie pushed off the car with a lazy grace, his shoes crunching on loose gravel.
"Welcome home, kid,"
he said, his smirk widening.
"Thought you'd need a ride."
Frankie didn't answer right away. He let his gaze wander, taking in the faded storefronts beyond the depot, the dim yellow light from a corner bar, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. It felt like looking at a photo album from another life. He hadn't expected banners or parades, but the absence of acknowledgement hit harder than he'd admit. Finally, he nodded, tossed his duffel into the back seat, and slid into the passenger side. The Mercury's engine purred to life, a low, steady growl as it eased away from the station. Through the passenger window, the city rolled past in a kaleidoscope of decay and memory. Rusted fences lined the rail yard, their jagged edges catching the dying light of the setting sun. Smoky bars and shadowed alleyways blurred together, a grim mosaic of a city that didn't sleep, didn't rest, didn't care. Charlie lit a cigarette as they turned onto Charles Street, the orange glow briefly illuminating his lined face.
"Your old man's been waiting for this day,"
he said, exhaling smoke that coiled in the confined space of the car.
Just don't mention the money."
Frankie turned his head sharply, his dark eyes narrowing.
"What money, Charlie?"
Charlie chuckled, low and humorless, flicking ash out the window.
"Exactly, Frankie."
Exactly. The answer hung in the air, heavy and unsatisfying. Frankie let it go for now, focusing instead on the streets outside. They passed a corner where a group of kids played stickball under a flickering street lamp, their laughter too loud, too forced, like they were daring the shadows to get closer. A man in a fedora leaned against a lamppost, his silhouette framed by the garish glow of a neon sign advertising cold beer and hot eats. Frankie caught the gleam of a flask in the man's hand, the kind of detail you noticed when survival meant seeing everything. The car rolled to a stop in front of a brick row house. Its facade was worn, its bricks dulled by decades of rain and neglect. A cracked window on the first floor exhaled the scent of cheap cigars and burnt coffee, pulling Frankie back to childhood mornings when those smells meant his father was home.
"You're up, kid,"
Charlie said, nodding toward the house.
"Go say hi to the old man."
Frankie stepped out, the stoop groaning under his boots as he ascended. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of his father's world was pressing down on him. He paused at the door, the peeling paint daring him to knock, then pushed it open without ceremony. The inside was as he remembered, cramped but clean, the air thick with the layered smells of frying onions, stale beer, and sweat-soaked work shirts. The living room was a shrine to Baltimore's working class. Black and white photos of stevedores at the docks hung crooked on the walls. An Orioles pennant pinned above an overstuffed couch, and an ashtray overflowing with crushed cigarette butts sat on a scarred coffee table. In the middle of it all sat Big Frank. His father was a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered, with a chest like a barrel. Time and hard living had softened his edges, but not by much. His salt and pepper hair stuck out at odd angles, and his eyes, once sharp as razors, had dulled, clouded by weariness and whiskey. He nursed a glass of the latter in his massive hand, the liquid catching the light as he swirled it absently.
Frankie.
Big Frank rumbled, his voice deep and gravelly. He set the glass down with a clink and leaned forward, the old armchair groaning under his weight.
Look at you. 6 fucking years, and you still walk in here like you own the damn place.
Frankie dropped his duffel by the door and crossed his arms, his stance defiant, but tired.
I didn't think I needed an invitation.
Big Frank barked a short laugh, humorless and sharp.
Still got that mouth, huh? Guess some things don't change.
He paused, his expression softening just a fraction.
You look good, kid.
Frankie's lips twitched in a faint smirk.
You look good as well, Pop.
Don't bullshit me. I've got mirrors.
He took a long sip, then set the glass down with a heavy thud.
Sit down. Let me get a good look at you.
Frankie hesitated, then sat on the couch across from his father. The silence stretched between them, thick and full of unspoken things. Big Frank's eyes flicked over his son, taking in the hardened lines of his face, the scars visible and invisible, the way he carried himself like a man always ready for the next fight.
You're different.
Big Frank said finally, his voice low.
The war will do that to you.
Frankie shrugged.
You don't go through 6 years of hell and come out the same.
Big Frank nodded, his gaze dropping to the glass in his hand.
Fair enough.
He leaned back, the chair creaking under him.
Look, Frankie, there's something I need to tell you.
Frankie frowned, leaning forward.
What is it?
Big Frank hesitated, his expression darkening.
I've got a debt, Frankie, a big one, to Moretti.
Frankie's jaw tightened.
Vito Moretti, the wolf?
Big Frank nodded, his eyes filled with regret.
I didn't want you to know, but they're circling, kid, and I don't think I can get out of this on my own.
Frankie sat back, the weight of his father's words pressing on him like a physical force.
I'll take care of it, Pop.
Big Frank's gaze was sharp.
This isn't your fight, Frankie.
It is now.
Frankie said firmly. Frankie stood, grabbing his duffel.
I've been dealing with unfriendly people for 6 years, Pop. I think I can handle Baltimore.
As he turned to leave, Big Frank's voice stopped him.
Frankie.
He paused, his hand on the doorknob.
Watch your back, son.
Big Frank said, his tone uncharacteristically soft.
There's sharks in these waters, and some of them are already circling.
Frankie didn't respond, didn't turn. He just opened the door and stepped back into the cold night, the air feeling heavier than when he'd arrived. The weight of the city pressed on his shoulders, and he knew it wasn't just the city. It was the shadows, the whispers, and the debts that never stopped growing.